Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'm Lara, adoptee, adoption researcher, psychotherapist and wellbeing advocate. And today I'm talking about externalizing behaviours. So far I have talked about some of the ways in which adoptees will attempt to cope with their feelings, the loss, the trauma, the fear, all of the things that go on even pre-verbally. I've talked about internalizing behaviours and I've talked about externalizing behaviours. My last video went into a little bit more in detail about those internalizing types, where we know that largely adoptees tend to fall into one of two groups, those that internalize and those that externalize. And just to recap very quickly on what that actually means, internalizing behaviours are those which are directed at the self, so that a person might become very withdrawn and they're processing a lot within their mind. They're all up in their heads, as we say. They struggle socially, they may not be very talkative, they're just very, very quiet, often very compliant. I covered that in the previous video, and today's video is about the other group. It's about the externalizing group. And I know that many of you are experiencing that with some of your adoptees, in ways that what you're seeing is that the anger, the frustration, the fear are being acted out externally. So it's not being directed at the self, it's being directed at others very often. And this can be very, very difficult. And as I mentioned previously, whilst it's marginally better for the person going through the behaviour because they have found an inefficient but an outlet nonetheless for their fear and anger, for the parents involved, it's very, very difficult to manage, because you will be often on the receiving end of those externalizing behaviors. And what we know about anger is that it's one of the most physically felt emotions that there is. It's a very motivating emotion. And if you've ever experienced anger in your life, which I'm sure you have, it's a very typical human response, then anger can take over your whole body. And so for those who are externalizing their anger, it can be often quite a frightening environment to have to try to manage. So it can be very tricky for parents. I am not obviously diminishing the pain that adoptee is going through. It's very real, and they're struggling to know what to do with that emotion. Just before I go on to some of the ways in which I would recommend maybe looking at dealing or helping to deal with some of that, it's worth mentioning that even the internalizing types, you might see that there are sort of occasional outbursts, or you might find that once they get into adolescence, they are finding behaviours outside of the home which look more like externalizing behaviours, possibly less about anger, but behaviours which are played out in a social space, let's say, outside of themselves, in an attempt to try and deal with or to cope with the feelings of loss and fear and distrust that they have. So it's not that it's that clear cut, but you do largely see internalizing versus externalizing behaviours. So a little bit more about externalizing behaviours. As we've said, anger is a very, very motivating emotion in terms of physical energy. So what that will often motivate your child to do is throw things, throw themselves, could be quite physical. And we do need to find ways to get that physical energy out of the body and out of the self. And that's not just for adoptees, that's the kind of way that I work with anger generally, with people who experience uncontrollable anger, because we do have to learn to control ourselves socially. Otherwise, society would be a very uncomfortable place if people acted out their anger uncontrollably all the time. So we do have a social responsibility to learn to control our anger in certain circumstances. However, it's vital that it's not just locked down in terms of buried and just kind of locked away indefinitely, because that will cause more harm than good over the long term. So what we're looking for are healthy ways for the adoptee to channel that negative emotion. Very often a physical sport, one where there are boundaries. Clearly boundaries are very important. Physical exercise is absolutely crucial for a lot of this, and I know that a lot of people who work their anger out of themselves in what I would call a healthy way through physical exercise. For example, all sorts of anything that involves the body, anything that involves physical movement, let's say force and power, are really good ways to help people to externalize their anger. So often externalized behaviors do kind of start from a place of anger, but there are other feelings that kind of play into that as well. There are emotions of frustration, of sadness, and of not knowing where to put that sadness or how to deal with that sadness. So obviously running through these videos are some of the strands of the 6 things for effective parenting, adoption parenting, which I will link in the video. And there are various things within that. And one of the things is that your child needs to understand that you're secure within the relationship, so that if you're feeling that your child is acting angrily towards you, that you don't behave in a way that shows them that they are potentially being rejected on the basis of their behavior. And it's a tricky line to walk, because you're trying to educate them that they have to learn to manage their anger and frustration, but in a healthy way, whilst at the same time allowing space for that to exist, allowing for the communication around that to unfold. So it's a tricky job, but I believe one that can be achieved with success if you put your mind to it, if you know what's involved and what's at stake. So your own security around the relationship, not showing them any sense of rejection around it, but just what has sometimes been called a sort of a scaffolded approach to learning, which is that you're kind of going to allow them the space to simmer down, tell them that you're there for them to come and talk with you and express their feelings. As soon as they have simmered down, figured out what it is they're feeling and name those emotions, name those feelings, and see if they can try and identify the source of those feelings. Then come and talk to you about it if they're able to do that. If not, other means I mentioned in the first video, any kind of creative endeavors, drawing, creating, expression of the self, expression of the pained self is really important. And one really good thing that works for dealing with anger is what we call the no-send letter. So it's a gestalt approach, but essentially the person who's feeling the intense emotion will sit down, they would write a letter, maybe directed at somebody or maybe directed at nobody, maybe directed at the world. Anger, especially for an adoptee, is around sort of an anger that you can't necessarily direct at anybody in particular. It just exists, and that's one of the reasons why it can become very, very quickly quite toxic, because there's no real outlet, there's no channel for that. And there's nowhere to direct it necessarily. So it is very important that they A, try and identify what that's about, and B, express it. So as I always say, getting it outside, but in a healthy way. Externalizers are getting it outside of themselves, but not in necessarily a great way. So your scaffolded approach to helping them will be to show them what is the best way to deal with this. Number 1 is calming down. Number 2 is trying to figure out what it is they're feeling and expressing that in some way. And a no-send letter is a really good way of doing that. So they would write a letter that they're not going to send to anybody. They're not going to show you or anybody else, but it's just a way of allowing them to externalize everything that they're feeling with no agendas of anyone else on anyone else's part. They can write freely, they can express freely what they're feeling. And then for them to feel a little bit of closure, and it's not going to be a one-time thing, that's going to happen very frequently until they come to terms with what their anger is about and how they need to deal with that for themselves in what we say a scaffolded approach. And what that approach does is that it builds trust between the two of you. So I hope that helps you understand a little bit more about externalizing behaviours and encouraging your adoptee to deal with those behaviours in a healthy way, and all the while creating a safe environment for them to express themselves. And what that does is it builds trust. Obviously, they're dealing with issues of having been rejected and having been abandoned and potentially abused or left in very serious situations, and that's going to create trauma. There's no two ways about that. And so it's vital that they give that space to exist. And if you can offer that to them in your home environment, they're going to thrive and do much better than if they weren't allowed that space to explore it. As you know, this is something that I'm going to keep talking about. I'm talking about the research, and I'm talking about offering these videos by way of education for future adopters and adoptive parents. And what I care about is ensuring that adoptees of the future stand a decent chance of living with wellbeing. It's all very close to my heart personally, and it's something that I get a lot of satisfaction from, and I'm more than happy to have conversations with you about these things. So please, if you're finding these videos useful, do tell your friends and colleagues, share, and if you want to hear about new upcoming videos, hit the bell and you'll get that notification as soon as they come out. All right, see you soon.